New York's affordable housing community has greatly benefited from the leadership the New York Housing Conference has brought to federal housing policy. Our agenda has put preservation of public housing front and center and has emphasized the importance of private activity bonds to expanding affordable housing production. When COVID hit, New York's 2 senators and 11 members of Congress got on a Zoom call organized by Rachel and her team to learn about the scale of the devastation for renters and building owners caused by the pandemic, and also look to us for solutions. It is time to reimagine what we need from the federal government to restore living conditions in public housing, to address our homeless and housing crisis, and to make New York a more equitable city. It all starts with housing policy. I am delighted to introduce this morning's panel discussion on reimagining federal housing policy, moderated by Alexa Sewell, a nationally recognized leader in affordable housing. Alexa worked in Washington as a member of the Appropriations Committee staff for the National Alliance to End Homelessness and for HUD. After holding senior roles at CPC and HPD in New York, Alexa is now CEO of Settlement Housing Fund and, to my great pleasure, co-chair of the New York Housing Conference's Board of Directors. Let's get this important discussion started.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the panel on reimagining federal housing policy. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we can get right into the news of the day and what you can expect in the next couple of years or so on Capitol Hill. So with us, we have Congressman-elect Richie Torres. He is the Democratic representative-elect for New York's 15th Congressional District, and congratulations. We're so happy to see you going to Washington. Sarah Sadian, who is the Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Sarah oversees the coalition's broad congressional portfolio. Thanks, Sarah, for joining us. And we also have with us Peter Lawrence, who's the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at Novogradac Consulting. And lastly, somebody who you probably all recognize from past events, we have David Dworkin, who's the President and CEO of the National Housing Conference. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. So I thought we could start with a discussion about the lame duck session, which is a very short period of time between now and January 20th when we welcome a new Congress and a new president, but there is a lot going on. So Peter, could you please summarize for us the various bills being considered that have a potential impact on housing?
Sure, Alexa, and thank you to the New York Housing Conference for inviting me. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all at a very critical time as we get to the end of the year. As you mentioned, we are in the lame duck, and sometimes lame duck sessions can be very lame and nothing happens. And we were afraid that this session was turning out to be one of those. But in the recent days, I think things have taken a turn for the better. And there's momentum gaining on key pieces of legislation that would impact housing. First and foremost, of course, is the COVID-19 relief. And I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk a lot more about that. There's key $25 billion in emergency rental assistance that's being considered a part of this compromise COVID relief package that's gaining momentum. We'll see how that legislation goes forward. Secondly, there's also the, of course, fiscal year 2021 appropriations. The funding under a continuing resolution expires on the next week, next Friday, December 11th. And not only is it important for the housing and community development funding throughout the federal government, but it is traditionally a vehicle for a lot of other pieces of legislation, which includes a year-end tax package, which has typically included tax extenders and could potentially serve as a vehicle for key housing tax priorities, such as the wonky 4% low-income housing tax credit rate, which is so crucial to New York. And then the last issue is sort of also in the mix that has an impact on housing, is a disaster tax relief, which could include an allocation for low-income housing a disaster allocation, given to all the various states that experienced major federally declared disasters over the course of 2020. And we are following all of those potential vehicles for their impact on housing.
Wow. Okay. So spending bills, tax extender, disaster relief, and the big topic of the day, which is the COVID relief package. As of this taping, we're Friday, December 4th. There is lots of news about a potential agreement on a $908 billion package. I'm assuming by the time this airs, we will know exactly what's happened. David, could you please give us a sense of what this package might look like, what the main sticking points are, and what the big issues are? And let me just say that whatever sort of carries over that doesn't make it into this compromise bill, it's still worth talking about, because we will probably see that get picked up again in 2021.
You're muted is the cliche of 2020. I appreciate the opportunity. 3 days is a lifetime in the legislative calendar these days, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to be wrong. I am cautiously optimistic, that actually might even be too optimistic, that we may get some COVID relief. I think that our experience and the odds remain against us, because there is just such a toxic partisan dynamic on the Hill. The fact that we not only have some bipartisanship on the House side, but also the Senate, and that an increasing number of senators are starting to say, let's do this before we go, is really helpful. But without Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell, that's not going to happen. And at the end of the day, we also still have to count on President Trump signing the legislation. And that is a wild card in and of itself, given everything else that we've seen going on. So I think that we should take some comfort in seeing that there's $25 billion in emergency rental assistance in this legislation, but we should in no way rest on any laurels and be very vigilant, particularly in talking to Republican contacts and members, but also reinforcing with the Speaker and with the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, the importance of taking this down payment. It is not enough. No one thinks it is. I mean, some people think it is. No one in this room thinks it is. But it is enough to prime the pump and give us the time to actually have a conversation about what meaningful long-term support means, without having tens of thousands of people put out on the streets while we're trying to figure out what we didn't do. I'm a big supporter of this approach. I think it makes sense. We're going to see how the conversation evolves, but it's the part of the problem for us is that a lot of the controversy on this bill involves issues that are not directly involved with housing. So aid to states is a big issue. Senator McConnell wants legal liability exemptions. Those are the things that really are driving the conflict. I think that the $25 billion for rental assistance falls somewhere in the middle. It's not one of the issues like aid to small businesses that has really solid bipartisan support. I would characterize it as bipartisan appreciation. And so I would hope that if talks do fall off on a COVID relief package, that there may be a couple of issues that actually make it into the CR regardless. And I'd like to see rental assistance be one of them. It's
David,
one of
I
the few
wonder-
issues. I would just say this one last thing. It
Please.
is one of the few issues where landlords and tenants actually have enormous alignment. They both need this. And moratoriums are great at preventing evictions in the short term, but it doesn't pay the rent.
And I'm gonna ask Sarah to talk a little bit more about that. It's absolutely a huge issue for New York, for the coalition of people who are watching this. Could you just tell us also, though, because this is a big issue too, what is in the package for aid to state and local governments? Do you know?
Yeah. There's the state, local, and tribal governments component of the $908 billion aid package is $160 billion. There's also $180 billion in additional unemployment insurance. And that's particularly important because it's one of the ways that people have been paying their rent. And so it does supplement the value in terms of rental payment of the $25 billion. If you have no rental assistance and you lose your unemployment assistance, you're in a totally different world of pain.
Thank you. Congressman-elect Torres, I wonder if you could give us your sense of what New York's priorities are in all of this. There are a number of bills swirling around. What are you talking to your colleagues about? What are you hoping to see come out of a lame duck?
Well, I think what we're hoping for is a comprehensive COVID recovery package. You know, even though I'm not formally sworn in as a member of Congress, I've been active in conversations with the speaker. So every week, the speaker has weekly meetings with the heads of both the ideological and the identity caucuses, and I'm the representative for the freshman class. And I know from the first meeting that she's intent on passing an omnibus bill that includes not only the appropriations, but a comprehensive COVID package. And the key word there is comprehensive. If it were up to Mitch McConnell, there would either be no COVID package or a COVID package that only includes PPP and unemployment insurance. For the Democratic Conference and for the New York delegation, the exclusion of food assistance, housing assistance, local and state aid is a non-starter. So that bipartisan agreement around the $908 billion package is a real breakthrough. And the speaker has conveyed optimism about achieving an omnibus bill. And it seems like there's an abstract agreement about the need to combine the appropriations bills with the COVID package into a single omnibus bill. But you know, one should never underestimate the depth of partisanship in DC or the obstructionism of Mitch McConnell. And even if we pull it off, it should be seen as a down payment, as a foundation for much bolder action under a Biden presidency.
Right. Thank you. That's definitely the message we're hearing from President-elect Biden, that this would be a down payment. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about rent relief. Your National Low Income Housing Coalition has really taken the lead on arguing for Section 8 resources in particular. Can you talk a little bit about what you see the renters nationally are sort of facing at this point in time, and where you think this all might go for rent relief?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to underscore just how critical of a time it is right now for renters. We're already seeing a tsunami of evictions start to roll in. And when the CDC's eviction moratorium expires on December 31st, there's a lot of expectations that we'll see, you know, possibly tens of millions of renters who will be losing their homes. There's already 1 in 5 renters are behind on their rent. This is proportionately harming Black and brown renters. And when that moratorium lifts, those renters will owe somewhere between $34 billion and $70 billion in back rent, which is an amount that no renter could really afford to pay off. So there's enormous stakes here. And it not only is threatening to people's immediate health and safety because of not having a home, but we know that there are really long-term effects caused by evictions as well. Evictions are often a cause of poverty rather than just a symptom of poverty, and it has downstream effects on education, health, incomes, and other criteria. Most scary, I think, is the potential health outcomes right now. There's a great new study that came out on Monday that showed that if you just look at the evictions that happened between the start of the pandemic and when the CDC moratorium was put in place, those evictions alone resulted in an extra 400,000 cases of COVID and an extra 11,000 deaths as a result. So there's a really clear connection here between the ability for you to stay at home, for you to be able to socially distance and isolate, and evictions. In terms of rental assistance, I'm really hopeful that if there is a deal, rental assistance will be included. We're seeing more and more senators come to the table and recognize the need for rental assistance. What's interesting here is that the players who are negotiating aren't the ones who really historically have had a role in shaping housing policy necessarily. So it's not going through the committee structure. It's not going through necessarily the appropriation structure. It's a bipartisan group of senators who are working together. We are working very closely with them to try to shape this as much as possible to make sure that renters are protected in this process. We hear that an extension of an eviction moratorium is also still on the table, but as David said, it's not enough. And so now is really the time for advocates to be weighing in. There has never been a more important time for advocates to be weighing in, to be talking about the need for maintaining that $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, targeted to people who are most at risk of losing their homes over the next 3 months. But we also need resources for people who are experiencing homelessness and long-term resources as well. So don't let up, keep the pressure on, and hopefully in a couple weeks we'll have an answer about where we are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your work on that. It really is so important. Peter, I want to come back to you quickly to talk about the tax extenders, because one of the things that that we've been working hard on in New York and that we care a lot about is something that you know a lot about, and that's fixing the 4%, the 4% low-income housing tax credit, which is currently floating. And had it been fixed, the New York Housing Conference released a report that said that we would have gained $240 million in equity for affordable housing projects, but instead we lost $51 million because of the floating rate. We're working very closely with Senator Schumer's office. I know our entire delegation is working on this. What do you think? Do we have a chance of fixing the 4?
Yes is the short answer. And with advocacy, especially to someone as influential as Senator Schumer, we can push this over the finish line. Just a quick little background. And I would just say your estimates are probably an underestimate, because there are probably a number of properties that couldn't go forward because they're just simply not financially feasible. I think what you're capturing in that estimate are the properties that did get forward just barely, the skin of their teeth, lost a lot of equity. And they're really, we hear about it all the time, about properties that just can't go forward under the floating rate. And I just want to make sure folks, give some context to that floating rate. The 4% housing credit rate, it's the only proportion of the tax code that is impacted by federal borrowing rates. And the rates went down as low as 3.07 instead of the 4 as we refer to it. And while that may not sound a lot on first blush, what you've got to realize that under the formula that comes up with that number every month, that is determined by federal borrowing rates, the lowest it could go without federal borrowing rates going negative, which we know our economy is in real serious problem in that circumstance, is 3.00. So we're practically at the bottom that you could be at. And what does that really practically mean? That means 25% less equity to any particular typical project out there. And that's the difference between a property being financially feasible, whether it's new construction or an acquisition or rehab or not. And we at Novogradac have done an estimate, and nationwide, over the course of 2020 through 2030, if we have a minimum 4% rate enacted, we will see more than 137,000 units across the country being financed as a result. And in New York, more than 22,000 units. So important part in New York's affordable housing production and preservation. So the situation here is we are the major tax policymakers in Congress are right now negotiating a year-end tax package. And we hear, at least at the moment of this recording, that they are starting off with the package that nearly got enacted at the end of last year. I was fortunate to be at the New York Housing Conference Symposium last year, and I mentioned that we are so close to getting that 4% then, and we were up until 6 p.m. before the day that the bill was released, we were in. That 4% was in, and it came out at the very last second. It was very unfortunate circumstances, but we are once again in that same circumstance, and those elements of the package that didn't advance last year are being put on the table yet again. And I think we're in a better position this time because we have, I think, better support. We now have over 220 members of the House that are co-sponsored the bill of which the minimum 4% rate is the keystone. 40 members of the Senate, and I think there's a recognition that given the COVID-19's impact, which has exacerbated the situation worse, there is a rationale to actually including it in a year-end tax package. But I do want to say, please reach out to Senator Schumer to urge him to make sure this is in there, and reach out to the New York delegation that sits on the Ways and Means Committee. There's Representative Swazi from Long Island. It would be really important for his office to hear how important this is for New York, so that we're in that last push.
Great. Thank you for that advice. I want to turn to politics and 2021. Brooklyn's Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, who wasn't able to join us today, did pre-record a message that we're going to air, and then I want to come back to you guys and ask you about it. So let's hear from the congressman.
Hello, I'm Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and it is my honor to represent parts of Brooklyn and Queens in the United States Congress. Let me begin by thanking Rachel Fee for the tremendous work that she does to ensure that there's affordable housing for people throughout the city of New York, and for inviting me to address you today. I thank everyone who has joined this important symposium on reimagining federal housing policy. It is a pleasure to be with you virtually. The affordable housing crisis remains the most pressing issue of the day. Gentrification is a problem. Displacement is a problem. Overdevelopment is a problem. The 1970s through the early 80s, into the 90s, there were some who actually fled New York City, but many remained, worked hard, sacrificed, and helped turn the situation around in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood, including in the central Brooklyn communities that I now represent. But many of these same individuals are now at risk of being pushed out of the only place that they've ever called home. And that's why it's important that we do all that we can to ensure that there are affordable housing opportunities, both in terms of preservation and creation, so that individuals aren't victims of their own success. We cannot allow New York City to become a place simply for the wealthy and the well-off, and everybody else will have no place to go. That is why it's critically important that the federal government get back into the business of affordable housing. And that is what we intend to do. We find ourselves in the midst of a challenging COVID-19 pandemic, which has exacerbated the already existing economic strife and housing challenges that we had in New York City. Far too many people are on the brink of homelessness and displacement. New York City is in need of comprehensive assistance, and we intend to deliver it. I'm so thankful for the leadership of Democratic Senate Leader Chuck Schumer, and I pledge to do all that I can in my capacity as chair of the House Democratic Caucus to make sure that we are working together to deliver meaningful relief to those individuals that are struggling with the possibility of homelessness and displacement in the context of this pandemic, and also to build back better and pass comprehensive legislation at the federal level that creates affordable housing opportunities for working families, middle-class folks, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, and of course, older Americans, and to make sure that we provide the New York City Housing Authority with the assistance necessary, and that we promote homeownership opportunities. This is no easy task, but help is on the way on January 20th. And I look forward to working with President Joe Biden and then Vice President Kamala Harris to make sure that the federal government is back into the business of creating and preserving affordable housing, particularly for the least amongst us. So thank you, Rachel, and let me thank the New York Housing Conference for all that you have done and will continue to do to reimagine housing policy for our city, our state, and indeed our nation. God bless you. God bless your work. And God bless the United States of America.
Okay, so I want to get reactions to that. I want to start with you, Congressman-elect. Is help on the way?
Well, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is the chair of the Democratic Conference, so you can safely assume that I agree with 100% of what he just said. His diagnosis that the affordability crisis is the single greatest challenge confronting our city. It has been even before COVID and has only been compounded by COVID. And I'm optimistic. Look, the Trump administration, the Trump presidency did not become the apocalypse for affordable housing that many, including myself, had feared and predicted, because the Democratic House was remarkably effective at, it's often said that when it comes to the budget, the president proposes and the House disposes, and the Democrats in the House were remarkably effective at disposing of Donald Trump's worst affordable housing policies. So if we can maintain funding for affordable housing in the face of a Trump presidency, then I'm optimistic that we can dramatically expand funding for affordable housing in partnership with Joe Biden. But how optimistic I am will ultimately depend on the Senate. If Mitch McConnell retains control of the Senate, it's going to be a real constraint on our ability to reimagine housing policy. If my friend Chuck Schumer is the majority leader, then the sky's the limit, and we're going to have real opportunities for imagining housing policy. So I'm optimistic, but I will be even more optimistic with a Democratic Senate.
Thank you. Sarah, maybe I could ask you to talk a little bit then about the Biden administration's housing priorities, and talk a little bit about that and how you think that may align with this new Congress, given the reality of that we're not exactly sure how things are going to shake out in the Senate. And then if you feel like it, or if you think there's relevant things, talk to us a little bit about what you think a new HUD might prioritize.
That's a great question. And like the Congressman-elect says, a lot depends on the outcome of the Senate races. But we do know that the Biden team has put together a really bold housing agenda. It's probably the most any presidential candidate has had on housing coming in on day one. And there are a lot of really excellent pieces of it that have to be prioritized next year. So one key piece of it is expanding housing vouchers to every family that's eligible. Right now, only 1 in 4 households that are eligible get any sort of assistance. 3 out of 4 are left to fend for themselves. So that we're really excited about the president's focus on making sure that people with the very lowest incomes can afford housing. There's also really important pieces of his plan to expand supply through $20 billion in the National Housing Trust Fund, by encouraging better land use and zoning regulations at the local level, by looking at the intersection between climate change and housing and the need for repair, including of public housing. So there's a big portfolio of things to be talking about next year. In terms of HUD, and this is something HUD can do largely outside of Congress. So regardless of the Senate outcomes, HUD is going to have a long laundry list of things to do, making up for the last 4 years of a lot of damage that was done. And probably the place where President Trump has done the most harm has been around civil rights and fair housing regulations. And so my hope is that the Biden administration plans to focus on not just undoing the harm from the Trump administration, but proactively moving us forward to a place where we can better achieve racial equity.
Thank you. David, I want to turn to you and ask you to talk also about what you think a new sort of housing policy might look like in the next Congress. You've talked about wanting to see a new era of housing legislation. What does that mean for GSC reform and housing finance programs that we care about in New York City, like the FFB?
A couple of things. I think that, first of all, we have to temper our expectations based on the numbers in the Senate. It's great to have big plans, but we also have to be able to count. And so when we look at the Senate, even if Democrats run the table in Georgia, that's a pretty bold statement in and of itself. We're looking at 50-50 with a continued need to get 60 votes to get legislation on the floor. So that basically means Chuck Schumer has the worst job in Washington. I think that we're going to have to continue to really focus on bipartisan solutions, and we're going to have to think outside the box. We have 20th century programs for 21st century problems. And so I think that we're going to have to take a very careful look at how we incent production to address many of these problems. When it comes to GSE reform, I think that short of the FHFA and the Treasury Department really going way outside of the bounds of any kind of reasonable, thought through impact on markets, we're not going to see anything on GSE reform for the foreseeable future. I think they're going to stay in conservatorship, although I do suspect there are opportunities for us to use the duty to serve regs to significantly increase their impact in affordable housing. On the FFB program, I think I'm really encouraged about that. It is in the Biden plan. It is a program that was really important to New York and California. You were a little too successful because President Trump decided that this was a blue state boondoggle. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that the FFB program actually helps rural areas even more than it helps states like New York and California. It's just that California, New York, and Massachusetts had the capacity to put the pilot in place. So I think that, allowing these kinds of investments to get the benefit of federal borrowing costs is going to be tremendous impact. And if you combine that with the 4% rate, you could see a real significant contribution to building affordable housing as a result of just those two policies.
And it makes money for the federal government as well.
It does indeed. So the FFB is actually a revenue raiser.
Okay, thanks, David. Thank you for giving us that update, and especially for the focus on the Federal Financing Bank. That is a top New York City priority. I want to stay on the topic of tax credits and go back to you, Peter, our tax credit expert. We talked about fixing the 4, but let's talk about some other proposals that are out there. Republicans have shown support for tax credits, so this could be an area of bipartisan support like David suggests we need. What are some of the other ideas out there? The New York Housing Conference has talked about lifting the cap for HUD-assisted projects. You have a proposal around the 50% test. Tell us a little bit about what are some proposals out there that you think might get some traction in the next Congress?
Indeed, both of those ideas, I think, are potentially on the agenda for next year. One of the bipartisan initiatives, big ticket policy agenda items for Congress next year is likely to be infrastructure. Been talked about for years and years. And the problem really is trying to figure out how to pay for it, not that there is any sort of partisan disagreement on the need to invest in the nation's infrastructure. But I do believe we've heard from House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Richie Neal that this is going to be a very important part of his 2021 agenda. And we've been making the case for a while that affordable housing, community development should be a part of investing in the nation's infrastructure. And so I am hopeful that proposals such as either exempting the private activity bond cap, the tax exempt bond cap that's often used with 4% low-income housing tax credits could be a part of that. Or, and it's not just my proposal passed by the House back in July as part of their House infrastructure bill to lower the finance buy test for private activity bonds from 50% to 25%, which doesn't change the overall volume of private activity bonds, but allows you to access that 4% credits that's so crucial in New York and many other states with only 25% of this valuable resource of private activity bonds as opposed to 50% of the total development costs. And that, in essence, is sort of a doubling of the production and preservation capacity of New York's private activity bond cap. And I do think that that proposal, there's a small chance there might be a temporary lowering of the 50% test as part of a lame duck package, but I think there's an even greater chance that it will be considered as part of the 2021 agenda. And there's a number of others. Of course, there's actually more than 24 proposals in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act I mentioned earlier, where the minimum 4% is the keystone to that. But there's also an increase to the 9% allocation nationwide, given the tremendous need for financing of affordable rental housing. And all told, if you look at all of the major housing tax credit provisions of the House infrastructure bill that did pass in July, is still pending in the Senate, of course. But if it were to be reconsidered next year, we estimate at Novogradac that over 1 million units of affordable housing nationwide could be financed. So that's really underscores the importance of that. I just want to mention 2 other regulatory things, since we were talking about that earlier with Sarah and David, that impact the housing credit. And one, of course, David knows very well, is the Community Reinvestment Act. One thing we expect a Biden administration to appoint a new comptroller of the currency who could revoke regulations that were finalized by the existing Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in May. That final regulations, we believe, is damaging to affordable housing and community development. And so it's in the process of, it's got a long implementation period, but a new comptroller could revoke that. We're hopeful that President Biden's appointee will do that, and we get to restart the process and potentially use the regulatory revoking process to actually increase investment in affordable housing. The banks have the capacity to do that, even more so than they have done before those May regulations were enacted. And we need to work with advocates across the country, including New York, to make sure that those regulations are updated appropriately. And the other last thing I would say is the Federal Housing Finance Agency has placed a limit on GC's investment in the low-income housing tax credit of $500 million each. That's an arbitrary amount. There's nothing in statute that suggests that that's an appropriate amount. And a new FHFA could easily increase that limit and put more investment in housing would help, sort of make the investment market even more robust and add more to average housing credit equity.
Yeah, if I could jump in on CRA, I think it's really important for supporters of the New York Housing Conference to pay a lot of attention to the fact that the Federal Reserve Board is now in the middle of an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is the beginning of a regulatory process for the Fed to draft its own rule. And that is the avenue that the OCC could use to come off of its proposal and join with all 3 regulators, the third being the FDIC, to do that. Lael Brainerd is the governor of the Fed, who's been taking the lead on this for Chairman Powell. She's had great support from the other Fed board governors. And I think it's really important to take a close look at that. If you're involved in affordable housing in any way, this is going to have a big impact on your ability to attract lending and capital. So you have a big stake in how this ends up. And then I would just note that CRA is badly in need of modernization. It was a tremendous opportunity that the OCC blew, quite frankly, and it is not too late to get this right.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for adding that. Very important. Congressman-elect, we haven't talked enough about public housing when we think about the next Congress. This is something that New Yorkers who care about New York are really focused on. What do you think we can expect in the next Congress that could be done for public housing and, for NYCHA?
Look, our expectations depends on the political realities in Washington, D.C., but I'm optimistic we're going to secure funding for public housing. The question is to what extent. I'm supportive of NYCHA's plan for preserving public housing. It would create a sustainable framework for financing public housing. As I understand it, the plan has 3 components. It envisions the state legislature creating a housing trust, and then envisions the federal government appropriating funds for an outsized number of tenant protection vouchers, and then enabling the housing authority to pool those vouchers to facilitate borrowing. The intellectual in me supports the plan. The political operative in me tells me that it might be uncomplicated it's going to be a heavy lift to advance a plan that requires approval at every level of government. And in the short term, it's just much simpler to expand the Public Housing Operating Fund and the Public Housing Capital Fund and the Section 8 program. So the pursuit of NYCHA's preservation plan is a much longer undertaking, even under the most favorable political circumstances in the Senate. And I do think that the groundswell of energy and passion for climate justice, could be harnessed for the benefit of public housing. I often tell people, imagine, public housing is the natural laboratory for a renewable energy revolution in America. And imagine public housing is the greenest city in America with solar panels and rooftop gardens and energy retrofits and electric heating systems. So there could be an opportunity to pursue policies right at the intersection of climate justice and affordable housing preservation.
Sarah, did you want to add something?
There's a connection here with what Peter was saying earlier too about an infrastructure deal. We know that public housing funds are a very top priority of the chairwoman Maxine Waters, and with really strong advocacy in New York, obviously with Nydia Velasquez and others, we can get that done, I think, if there is an infrastructure package next year.
Housing is jobs. That's the bottom line. You're going to build housing, you're going to create jobs. A deep recession is an awfully good time to do that.
We agree. So let's do a really quick ending here, something kind of fun, real quick from all of you guys in a few words. How do you think the Biden administration will compare to the Trump administration on housing? David, you first.
I guess the cliche would be night and day, with day being what you're doing and night being when you're sleeping.
Peter?
I'd say sea change. Really, I think we've seen already the Biden administration has a very robust affordable housing plan of $640 billion. They want to invest in it. They've got already in the transition team members who are experienced, who care about affordable housing. And I am confident, although as David noted earlier, we do have very narrow margins in the Senate, as well as the House for that matter, which will make big, bold legislative solutions a bit of a challenge. But certainly in terms of the administration, Biden is a sea change.
Sarah?
Well, I completely agree with David and Peter. I'll just say that just because things sound really good and it's definitely going to be better than the Trump administration, we can't let off the pressure. We have to keep holding the Biden administration and Congress hold their feet to the fire to make sure that housing is a priority, and that within housing, we're making sure we're serving the needs of people with the very lowest income.
We're all focused on rental assistance and preventing evictions and foreclosures. Joe Biden is the first president in American history who actually had the experience of losing his home because his dad lost his job. So I don't think we'll ever have I hope we never have a more empathetic president about what we really care about and what we're trying to avoid. I think that, we need to leverage that as much as possible.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you. Last word to our wonderful Congressman-elect, please.
That's the easiest question. Look, we have a president who actually believes in affordable housing, who's committed to the vision of housing as a human right and housing as infrastructure, and has put forward the boldest vision of affordable housing that we've seen ever from a president-elect. And, one example, his appointment to his nominee for OMB is herself a product of Section 8. So for many in the Biden administration, affordable housing is not an abstraction. It's a game changer for them personally.
Thank you. And thank you all. We are out of time. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. This is a nice little introduction too for you, Congressman-elect, because you will be seeing all these folks down in Washington. There's some of the best advocates down there. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I hope that everybody enjoyed our panel today. I want to let everybody know that we're going to be taking a 5-minute break, but don't go far, because up next, we're going to have the Honorary Awards program, remarks from Senator Chuck Schumer, and the announcement of the winner of this year's competition. Thank you.